Good evening, and on behalf of the Center for Civil and Human Rights, welcome to Washington Hall and to this memorable evening together. Thank you especially to you, Father Ted, for coming to join us as we celebrate these 40 years of the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the longer, even than that, legacy of your work in civil rights and for racial equality in our country. I'd like to thank in particular our co-sponsors for this event, the Notre Dame Student Government, the Hesburgh USCO Scholars Program, the Department of Africana Studies, the Center for Social Concerns, and also the Hesburgh Libraries. The Hesburgh Libraries, I should mention in a special way, I'm grateful to because the archival work on which this lecture was done has been thanks to the great work that's being done to preserve Father Ted's archives in the Hesburgh Libraries. It's a great pleasure also to be welcoming here my colleague from the law school, Professor Jennifer Mason McAward. Professor Mason McAward is a longtime member of the Notre Dame family. She received her undergraduate degree here in 1994, summa cum laude, having majored in government with a minor in theology. She served as president of the folk choir here, a passion for music that she continued for some years after her return, singing with the Collegium Musicum. I dare say if we ask her very nicely at the end, maybe she'll even sing us the alma mater to make up for the deficiencies of Saturday. After graduation, Professor Mason McAward spent a year volunteering with a women's and children's center in Portland, Maine through the Holy Cross Associates program, exemplifying precisely the Congregation of Holy Cross's ideal to be educating students in both mind and heart, to be here at Notre Dame where, as we aspire, learning becomes service to justice. After that service, she went to law school at NYU, where in 1998 she received her JD, again summa cum laude, graduating first in her class, and having served as managing editor of the Law Review there. She went on from there to distinguished judicial clerkships, first with Judge Alex Kaczynski in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then from there to the United States Supreme Court, where she clerked for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Then, after a brief period practicing law and serving as a legal professional, we were fortunate enough to lure her back to South Bend and to join the faculty of the law school in 2005. Since then, she's been teaching courses in constitutional law and civil rights and has developed a scholarly expertise, in particular in studying the relationship between Congress and the federal courts in the protection of individual rights. The students of our law school immediately recognized what an exceptional teacher she was. Less than 2 years after her arrival, they selected her as the Distinguished Professor of the Year. So today we're very fortunate to be here to hear the lecture based on the fruits of her research, precisely in the Hesburgh Libraries and in the archives of Father Ted, on the civil rights legacy of the Reverend Theodore M. Hesburgh, C.S.C. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mason McAward.
Well, thank you, Paolo, and thank you, Father Hesburgh, for allowing me the honor of giving this talk. Years ago, in my first semester as a professor at Notre Dame, the very first class I taught was civil rights law. And one day, one of my students came to me and asked if it would be appropriate for our class to meet with Father Hesburgh. I said, that would be amazing. He's a civil rights legend. But I was too intimidated by that legend to actually call his office and request a meeting. So coward that I was, I made the student do it instead. As it turns out, Father Hesburgh was entirely gracious and since has met with and inspired my civil rights law students every year. And that graciousness has transformed the coward of years ago into your speaker tonight. So again, thank you, Father Hesburgh. In his meetings with my civil rights students, Father Hesburgh regales them with stories of his 15 years on the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He often leads with the story of when the commissioners were denied lodging while holding hearings in Alabama in 1958. No hotel in segregated Alabama would lodge the members of a presidentially appointed commission because one commissioner was African American. A federal Air Force base also refused them rooms for the same reason until President Eisenhower personally intervened. My students are aghast to learn of such discrimination. In our meetings, Father Hesburgh moves on to more hopeful stories of civil rights reform, leaving unspoken stories that would really leave my students speechless. There are too many to recount, of course, but one that struck me was a conversation Father Hesburgh had with an African-American mother on a South Shore train platform in Chicago in the late 1950s. Here's how Father Hesburgh once described it. She told me that one day she was giving her 4-year-old little boy a bath, and when she told him to scrub hard, he asked, "If I scrub hard enough, will I become white?" She said, "No, you're colored and you'll always be colored." To this, the boy had a very laconic answer. He said, "It's better to be white." Father Hesburgh said, I asked her if she had said anything in answer to her son. She replied, "Well, what could I say? Isn't it really better to be white? Aren't you assured of a better education, of a better opportunity for making a living, of a better house, of a better neighborhood, of better associations if you happen to be born in the United States as a white person, as distinguished from being born as a Negro?" This mother's lived experience of what Father Hesburgh has called the ineluctable trilogy of education, employment, and housing provides essential perspective on the task of the Civil Rights Commission generally, and the civil rights legacy of Father Hesburgh in particular. As Father Hesburgh has said repeatedly, those basic civil rights, as well as the right to vote, are all interconnected. Denying a person equal opportunity with respect to education or voting, or to his or her ability to choose a job and a house commensurate with his or her education and achievement, destroys motivation and visits, quote, the stigma of second-class citizenship upon that person and his or her family. This talk will discuss Father Hesburgh's advocacy on these core civil rights issues: education, housing, employment, and voting rights, and how his work changed the face of this country. The story of Father Hesburgh's civil rights advocacy is a key to understanding how he emerged, in the words of Vice President Biden, as, quote, one of the most powerful unelected officials this nation has ever seen. It is vitally important at the outset to understand the philosophical and theological framework that forms the basis for Father Hesburgh's views on civil rights. For him, the crucial starting point is the sacred nature and God-given dignity of the human person. From this reality should flow the conviction, nihil humanum mihi alienum, translated, nothing human is alien to me. According to Father Hesburgh, if each of us truly held this conviction, we would necessarily appreciate with compassion, quote, every human suffering and every human ill, every neglected opportunity that is closed off to another person. Father Hesburgh argues that if compassion were the overriding conviction of our lives, then we would necessarily seek abiding human solutions to the great inequalities and injustices of our time. Ordained a priest in 1943, Father Hesburgh held these convictions even prior to his service on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. But it was his 15-year tenure on the commission, from 1957 to 72, that gave him the opportunity to learn directly about the suffering and closed opportunities experienced by racial minorities in this country. As Father Hesburgh wrote in 1961, racial disparities in education, voting, jobs, and housing demonstrated that we as a nation were, quote, flouting our magnificent Constitution and failing to acknowledge man's inner dignity and rightful aspiration to equality, unless he happens to be a white man. Congress created the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in the Civil Rights Act of 1957, conceiving of it as a bipartisan, independent executive agency and directing it to investigate race-based deprivations of voting rights and of the right to equal protection of the laws. Even this modest mandate outraged Southern segregationists. Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina infamously filibustered for more than 24 hours the act that created the commission, and Senator James Eastland of Mississippi engaged in multiple tactics to stall its creation. Ultimately, though, President Eisenhower appointed 6 commissioners with diverse backgrounds. 3 were Northerners, 3 were Southerners, 3 were Democrats, 2 were Republicans, and 1 claimed political independence, Father Hesburgh. At the Commission's inception, skeptics lamented that it was likely to pursue, quote, the cause of moderation, and unlikely, quote, to break many lances crusading for civil rights. Still, the Commission held hearings throughout the South and documented extensive voting rights and other civil rights violations. Over time, it expanded its inquiries into housing, employment, education, public accommodations, and the administration of justice. By the end of Father Hesburgh's tenure on the Commission, including nearly 4 years as chair, Congress had enacted roughly 70% of the Commission's recommendations, incorporating them into critical pieces of civil rights legislation, including the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It might be tempting to diminish Father Hesburgh's contributions to the Civil Rights Commission by characterizing him as simply one of 6 commissioners. From the inception of the Commission, however, it was clear that he was a first among equals. In 1959, as the Commission sought to draft its initial report to Congress, Father Hesburgh arranged for the commissioners to fly from their lodgings at an Air Force base in 100-degree-plus Shreveport, Louisiana, to Notre Dame's Land O'Lakes property in Wisconsin. While the other 5 commissioners enjoyed the flight, Father Hesburgh sat in the rear of the plane with Commission staff and drafted the resolutions that would be at the heart of the report. After an evening of fishing, martinis, and crisp Wisconsin air, Father Hesburgh strategically presented those resolutions to the Commission and asked for a vote. The results were better than anyone could have hoped. 13 of 14 recommendations were unanimous, with a single dissent on voting rights. When the Commission presented its report to President Eisenhower, he marveled at the unanimity of the politically and geographically diverse Commission. Then Father Hesburgh informed him that he had not just appointed Republicans and Democrats, or Northerners and Southerners. He had also appointed 6 fishermen. Upon hearing the Land O'Lakes story, the President replied, "We've got to put more fishermen on commissions and have more reports written at Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin." The publication of the Commission's report in September 1959 was front-page news across the country. The report received praise for its dispassionate, humane analysis, but it also engendered vitriolic criticism from segregationists, whose harsh words only served to underscore the report's significance. Senator Strom Thurmond, for example, proclaimed that the Commission's recommendations constituted an attempt to, quote, rape the rights of the states and the people, and that its proposals about voting rights could lead to, quote, outright dictatorship. Despite the predictable Southern backlash, the report legitimized the Commission and invigorated efforts to extend the Commission's lifetime past its original expiration date in late 1959. As the Washington Post editorialized, quote, to cut off the Commission after it has made so promising a beginning and finds so much territory yet to be explored would be an inexcusable blow to the cause of civil rights. Thus, we have Father Hesburgh to thank for the fact that the work of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has continued for now 54 years past its original 2-year term. Although the Commission has languished in recent years, Father Hesburgh was a key voice on the Commission during its most influential period, during the late 1950s and 1960s. Let's turn to how the Commission, and Father Hesburgh specifically, provided leadership on the issues of education, housing, employment, and voting over the course of the Civil Rights Movement. When Father Hesburgh began his tenure on the Civil Rights Commission, the vast majority of primary and secondary schools throughout the South remained segregated, despite the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling in Brown versus Board of Education that compulsory racial segregation in public schools violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Southern political leaders were overtly hostile towards desegregation, and congressional representatives from the South called for states to, quote, resist forced integration by any lawful means. In response, Mississippi chose to close its public schools rather than integrate them, while Louisiana amended its constitution to justify segregation as an exercise of its police powers. Georgia simply issued a resolution asserting that the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution and the respective guarantees of equal protection of the laws and voting non-discrimination were, quote, null and void. Against this background, the Commission held extensive hearings on the degree of compliance with Brown and theorized that where moral suasion and judicial mandates had failed to promote integration, financial incentives might work. Indeed, Father Hesburgh became the leading proponent of promoting non-discrimination through the threat of withholding federal funds. He initially proposed this idea in the Commission's 1959 report, in a joint statement joined by only 2 other commissioners. The following year, the entirety of the Commission adopted Father Hesburgh's approach, but only on a limited basis, recommending that Congress withhold funds from public colleges and universities that engaged in racial discrimination. That wasn't enough for Father Hesburgh, who wrote a supplemental statement arguing that the same condition should apply to all private schools as well. The Commission adopted this recommendation the following year. Most critically, Father Hesburgh prevailed with Congress, which in Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act permitted termination of federal financial assistance to any program or activity that discriminates on the basis of race. Although Title VI had an immediate and beneficial effect on school desegregation in the South, Father Hesburgh, with the rest of the Civil Rights Commission, recognized that de facto segregation in the North was a major impediment to school integration and equality. Because segregated housing patterns were the leading cause of de facto school segregation, the Commission conceptualized equal educational opportunity and fair housing as inseparable issues and often incorporated recommendations about housing and urban renewal into its reports about education. Thus, a holistic approach to educational equality led the Commission to focus on housing discrimination. The Civil Rights Commission's first report made 2 major findings with respect to housing. First, the lack of quality, affordable housing was a national crisis. In 1950, for example, approximately 70% of non-white families lived in substandard housing. Second, the Commission found that many Americans were being deprived of equal access to housing due to their race. Indeed, in the early 1960s, the chairman of the FDIC testified before the Commission that banks were morally and legally obligated to engage in race discrimination. As the chairman described, quote, financing a real estate purchase for a member of a minority group might have a serious effect upon values in the neighborhood. If the bank already had a substantial number and dollar volume of mortgage loans in the neighborhood, it would necessarily consider the effect of extending a mortgage to a minority family upon these assets. Therefore, the chairman argued, banks must decline to finance minority real estate purchases out of, quote, responsibility toward the economic welfare of its depositors and stockholders. Father Hesburgh did not remain silent upon hearing such arguments. He blasted, quote, the sophisticated approach of the financial community, which says its concern in financing housing is purely economic, as though this somehow might cancel out the moral dimension of what their lack of moral concern causes to happen to human beings. He pointed to the arrogance of the, quote, unspoken but very effective conspiracies of builders, real estate brokers, and good neighbors who seek to preserve the blessings of democracy for their own white selves alone. He lamented that many white people would like to, quote, pretend that the poor are not with us or that blacks do not really exist. And, Father Hesburgh said, fear feeds upon fear, and suspicion grows, and a nation that offers the best hope for mankind shivers on the narrow edge of a breakdown. The Civil Rights Commission embraced 2 principal strategies with respect to housing: urban renewal reform and the prohibition of housing discrimination. The Commission's 1961 recommendation that federal funding for urban renewal projects be contingent on the availability of safe and adequate housing was implemented by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Commission's advocacy of a ban on race discrimination in the sale or rental of property ultimately became the landmark Fair Housing Act of 1968. Of course, housing discrimination persisted despite the Fair Housing Act. In 1971, the Commission heard testimony that systemic racial and economic discrimination still permeated the housing sale and rental markets. During those hearings, Father Hesburgh bemoaned a, quote, America where a white prostitute can buy a house that a black professional man can't buy. He went on to identify 3 systematic impediments to fair, open, and decent housing: individual prejudice, the not-in-my-neighborhood mentality of white suburbanites; local politics, which subordinated the concerns of minorities; and economics, which made it unprofitable to provide fair, decent housing for low and middle-income families. While Father Hesburgh thought that families, churches, and schools had the principal duty to ameliorate individual prejudice, he advocated for strong national leadership to address persistent disparities and economic imbalances in the housing market. As he did in the school setting, he proposed linking the availability of federal funds to a community's compliance with the national ideal of equal housing opportunity. Of course, without sufficiently lucrative employment options, racial minorities were limited with respect to their housing choices. When Father Hesburgh's tenure on the Civil Rights Commission began, African Americans filled a disproportionate number of low-skill jobs and were disproportionately unemployed. In some cities, more than 1/3 of the African American population was unemployed in 1961. By 1963, the unemployment rate of non-white workers had been more than twice of that of white workers for at least 5 consecutive years. Statistics such as these prompted the Commission to note that African Americans were, quote, the last hired and first fired. And although the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity had been established, it had limited jurisdiction and limited efficacy. The Civil Rights Commission heard extensive testimony on employment discrimination and the lack of adequate job training for minorities. In the early 1960s, the Commission, with Father Hesburgh's support and vote, recommended strong congressional action to ban employment discrimination in broad sectors of the American economy and to create a new federal body with jurisdiction over such discrimination. The Commission's recommendations were reflected in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans employment discrimination on the grounds of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Title VII also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. Job discrimination did not end overnight, and the Civil Rights Commission continued to hold hearings, make findings, and issue recommendations for legislative action. Based on the Commission's recommendations, Title VII was amended in 1972 to require state and local governments to provide equal employment opportunity. Also based on the Commission's recommendations, the enforcement powers of the EEOC were expanded to include the capacity to sue private employers. Congress was not the only body listening to the Commission. In its January 1970 hearing in St. Louis, the Commission discovered that the Defense Department had awarded McDonnell Douglas a multi-billion-dollar contract, even though the company lacked an adequate affirmative action plan and otherwise failed to satisfy federal equal opportunity standards. The Commission wrote to the Secretary of Defense condemning the lack of contractual oversight and requesting immediate corrective action. Shamed, the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, and McDonnell Douglas entered into an agreement creating a satisfactory affirmative action program and allowing the contract to move forward contingent on implementation of that new program. While affirmative action hiring programs are now standard among private corporations, this was a major development at the time. Indeed, an editorial in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch lauded the agreement as being emblematic of, quote, a new era in which the modern corporation has to use its skill not only to make things, but to help people. The last substantive area I'll discuss is voting rights, which were the initial focus of the Civil Rights Commission's mandate. When Father Hesburgh began his tenure on the Commission, intimidation and disenfranchisement characterized the state of the African American vote across the South. State and local officials used literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright physical violence to suppress the black vote in what Father Hesburgh described as, quote, a reign of terror. The story of Mary Thomas, an African American resident of Humphreys County, Mississippi, illustrates this state of affairs. During the mid-1960s, not a single one of the 5,500 non-white residents of the county was registered to vote. Thomas tried to register, but failed the literacy test, in which Mississippi required potential voters to interpret a section of the state constitution. White registrants were assigned the simplest of sections, and even the most inept answers were accepted. For instance, when asked to interpret a section of the state constitution, which required elections to be held every 4 years, a white applicant who wrote, quote, "The government is by the people and for the people," passed. African American registrants, by contrast, were assigned the most impenetrable sections, such as the one governing the intricacies of corporate taxation. And their answers were uniformly deemed unacceptable, even by voting registrars who by law were not themselves required to be literate. When Mary Thomas failed her literacy test, the voting registrar decided to teach her a lesson for even attempting to register. He took Thomas's picture and circulated it to county business owners so that she would have a difficult time getting credit. Thomas's impudence also outraged the county sheriff, who arrested her, jailed her for the night without access to a lawyer, and slapped her with a hefty fine. The Commission's ability to focus the national spotlight on the stories of Mary Thomas and other disenfranchised African Americans provided Congress with the ammunition and political cover it needed to enact the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Commission also made concrete recommendations that ultimately formed the core of these landmark bills, with its foremost priority being the eradication of literacy tests. With respect to voting, Congress was initially reluctant to go as far as the Commission had recommended, and as a result, the 1964 Act simply regulated certain standards and procedures for state literacy tests. Still, the Commission pressed on, and in 1965 it issued a report urging the abolition of all literacy tests, as well as the appointment of federal voting registrars, a ban on poll taxes, and the assignment of federal election monitors. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 enacted the Commission's recommendations regarding registrars and election monitors, but banned literacy tests only in a subset of jurisdictions. By 1970, though, Congress came to see the wisdom of the Commission's opposition to literacy tests and banned their use nationwide. Father Hesburgh exercised leadership on voting rights in a number of ways. He, of course, participated in formulating the Commission's influential policy recommendations, and he personally testified before Congress in support of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But he also intervened individually on behalf of frustrated African American citizens. As Father Hesburgh has recounted, the Commission heard testimony about a New Orleans scheme in which white registrars struck some 2,000 registered African Americans from the voting rolls. To re-register, these citizens were required to present 2 registered voters who would testify to their voting qualifications. Well, of course, there were no more registered African Americans to serve as witnesses, and no registered white person would vouch for a black voter. The Commission heard about this problem from an African American U.S. Army captain who had been disenfranchised. Unable to provide registered witnesses, this man went to the local registrar with photo ID, his federal income tax return, his professional credentials in dentistry, and his honorable discharge from the Army. Still, he was turned away. Upon hearing this story during a televised hearing, Father Hesburgh said, quote, "Captain, I believe you, and I am sure that everyone who is watching this on television believes you. Go back to that registration place tomorrow morning. If they don't register you, call me immediately and let me know, because I will then call the President of the United States, and I will tell him that one of his Army officers is being prevented from voting in Louisiana. I can promise you that the President will make things so hot for everyone that they will wish they had never heard of you." It appears that the local voting registrar was indeed watching Father Hesburgh on television during this exchange, and the next day the Army captain was registered to vote immediately. Father Hesburgh became a national figure as the result of his service on the Commission, and he was the Commission's most prominent member during his tenure. He turned down requests to run for the U.S. Senate and for the vice presidency, and instead became an uncompromising and savvy advocate for equality in the face of state and local resistance. He was also known for his belief that the commission should be, quote, a burr under the saddle of the federal government, and for his willingness to resist pressure from the presidents who appointed and reappointed him. Indeed, as chair of the commission in 1972, Father Hesburgh was vocal in his criticism of the Nixon administration's civil rights record. Infuriated, Nixon responded by forcing Father Hesburgh to resign from the commission. This dismissal only enhanced Father Hesburgh's national profile, as, in the words of Commonweal magazine, the, quote, epitome of so many of the nation's ideals in the areas of justice, human rights, and equal opportunity. Father Hesburgh's contributions to the cause of civil rights greatly exceeded his work on the commission. Most notably, he was a civil rights activist with close ties to the leaders of the movement, a relationship attested to by the famous picture of Father Hesburgh standing shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King Jr., singing "We Shall Overcome" at a civil rights rally in Chicago. With his moral authority and national stature, Father Hesburgh proved to be a valuable ally. Andrew Young, a leader in the civil rights movement, observed that, quote, the key to the success of the civil rights movement was to keep it from being a radical leftist movement, and recognized that it was truly a movement coming out of the Judeo-Christian U.S. constitutional tradition of justice. Well, Young continued, nobody could represent all of those forces like Father Ted could, and he did it in such a quiet, unassuming, non-judgmental way that when he was with you, you didn't have to worry about who was against you. Expressing a similar sentiment, President Carter noted that Father Hesburgh bridged the gulf between the civil rights movement and the white establishment. Because African American activists during that era were often marginalized, Carter argued, they were in dire need of, quote, very distinguished white leaders who would join with them and add imprimaturs of approval for what they were doing. And Father Ted was one of those who came forward. Father Hesburgh's civil rights legacy is not limited to his work with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He also served with distinction in a number of capacities in which he advocated for human rights, humanitarian relief, nuclear disarmament, and international development. He even chaired the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, a body which later came to be known simply as the Hesburgh Commission. The Hesburgh Commission's recommendations directly influenced Congress's 1986 law providing limited amnesty for undocumented immigrants. Even today, those same recommendations are receiving renewed attention as Congress debates immigration reform. For all of Father Hesburgh's nationally recognized work, he has been an advocate of civil and human rights at Notre Dame as well. During his 35-year tenure as president of the university, he engaged in multiple initiatives to fund minority scholarships and recruit minority students and staff. He founded the Center for Civil and Human Rights, which has become a leader in training human rights advocates around the globe. And from my humble perspective as an alumna of the university, he took the critical step of admitting women to the university's undergraduate programs. Although most point to 1972 as the pivotal year in which Father Hesburgh implemented that change, I would like to draw your attention to 1967, when he was personally responsible for the enrollment of Notre Dame Law School's first female student, Graciela Olivares. Graciela Olivares was a high school dropout and community activist in Arizona's Latino community. She had impressed Father Hesburgh while testifying before the Civil Rights Commission in 1962, but the two had no subsequent contact until a chance meeting in O'Hare Airport 4 years later. During that meeting, Olivares told Father Hesburgh about her continuing advocacy for Latinos and her concern that her work was not sufficiently effective. Father Hesburgh suggested that a law degree would give her credibility. He then called the president of Harvard University and arranged for Olivares to receive a full scholarship at Harvard Law School. He made the same offer on behalf of Notre Dame Law School, and Olivares ultimately chose Notre Dame. Graciela Olivares graduated in 1970 and went on to a distinguished career that included time as the chair of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, as well as her 1977 appointment as director of the Community Services Administration, the federal anti-poverty agency. In that role, Olivares was the highest-ranking Hispanic and third highest-ranking woman in the Carter administration. Olivares died of cancer at age 59. To this day, Father Hesburgh keeps a picture of Olivares and himself in his room, a remembrance of a dear friend and of his commitment to the importance of equal opportunity and the recognition of human dignity. I wish I could stand here and tell you that race discrimination is a thing of the past and that people of all colors and backgrounds enjoy equal access to education, housing, employment, and voting. I can't. Schools are resegregating at an alarming rate. Well over 1/3 of Latino and African American students attend schools where fewer than 10% of their classmates are white. The EEOC is inundated with more than 30,000 complaints of racially based employment discrimination each year, and the Fair Housing Administration receives 10,000 such housing complaints annually. Efforts to suppress minority voters continue. Between 1982 and 2006, the Justice Department blocked over 700 changes to state voting procedures, which it concluded were discriminatory. I imagine Father Hesburgh would say the same thing today as he did toward the end of his tenure on the Civil Rights Commission. One cannot hear about such racial division and, quote, conclude that all is right in our land. The problems are more complicated today than when the Commission began its work in 1957. The issues are not as clear, the solutions are not as readily apparent. But the crisis facing our country today is every bit as serious, if not more so. There are many more obstacles to be overcome before the dream of equality on which this country was founded is finally redeemed. All of us as Americans should be concerned and should look for answers that will help create a society where men and women can move about freely and people are not feared simply because they are strangers, and where every human being is assumed to be a person of dignity and value and worth and respected as such. The civil rights legacy of Father Ted Hesburgh is in part an impressive historical record of moral and political leadership. A critical piece of his legacy, however, resides in this room and in the hearts of all who heed his call. It is up to us to recognize the sacred value of each human being, and it is up to us to advance Father Hesburgh's work by ensuring that concern for human dignity is the guiding value of our communities and of our laws and policies. So thank you, Father Hesburgh, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jen. There is a little bit of time for just a few questions. My colleagues from the Center for Civil and Human Rights, Chris Cervanek and Sean O'Brien, are here in the audience with microphones so that they can take a few questions. We'd really prefer them to be from students if we can.
I promise not to sing if somebody will ask a question.
My name's Rachel Ganson, and I am a freshman here at Notre Dame. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming and giving this presentation. It was very, very informational, and I enjoyed it a lot. My question is, of all the things that Father Hesburgh did for civil rights, what was his favorite, do you think, in your vast study of it? I mean...
That's a heck of a question to answer when the man's sitting in the front row. I think you should take that up with him after the presentation. All I can tell you is that the list is long for him to choose from.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious to know how you see sort of Father Hesburgh's legacy playing out in today's political arena. Obviously, he was honored at Congress earlier this summer, and I'm curious to know, with possibly the recent Supreme Court decision on Voting Rights Act, how you might see his influence having a role in further conversation on race relations on the national level.
Thank you. That's a great question. Interestingly, since Father Hesburgh resigned from the commission at President Nixon's request, the commission has really languished. So after Father Hesburgh resigned, the position of chair of the commission went vacant for 16 months. And even after that, which destroyed the commission's morale and kind of left political questions looming about the role of the commission. And then, once President Reagan took office, he went ahead and fired 2 more commissioners for politically motivated reasons. So the commission has really had a hard time finding itself on stable footing. And so as to whether the commission itself can provide a valuable voice in, say, the current voting rights debates is up for question. There's been legislation that's amended the constitution of the commission so that it's presumably more insulated from political pressure. But we'll see how that plays out. There certainly are a lot of debates about voting rights going on since the Supreme Court's decision on voting rights this summer. And in recent days, the Justice Department has brought suit against the state of Texas and is anticipating bringing suit on Monday against the state of North Carolina to deal with what it perceives to be discriminatory voting reforms. Who's going to have the most prominent political voice in that debate? I don't know. I wish Father Hesburgh were still on the commission and still had the pulpit that he had back in the 1960s, because I think that having that kind of moral and political leadership that he had could really help advance the debate in a fruitful way. Whether we have anybody who has that stature today, I don't know.
Thank you. My name is Agustin Garcia. I'm a sophomore. I had the opportunity to meet Ambassador Andrew Young over the summer. He was doing a documentary about sort of like the story behind the civil rights movement and the violent part of it and the sad part of it. And it caught my attention that you mentioned that your law students, when they go with Father Ted, could have heard more stories that could have been more shocking. So from your research, what could be done to share these stories that are maybe the sad part of the civil rights movement and the violence that involved in it?
I mean, that's incumbent on teachers at places like Notre Dame to share those stories with their students, right? And so even though it wasn't my initial idea, taking students to meet with Father Hesburgh every year has proved to be, I think for many of my students, kind of the single most formative experience of their time at Notre Dame, or at least so many have told me. And so hearing from him his reflections on the Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal and that that's a self-evident truth, and learning about how he can take that insight, or how he took that insight and translated it into legal and policy initiatives, I think is really inspirational for students. And so it's a combination of hearing stories and learning about the human dimension of civil rights violations and finding a way to bridge those human stories with legal and policy lessons.
Hi, my name is Katie Lance, and I'm a first-year PhD student in psychology and peace studies. And I'm wondering, for those of us who are interested in doing work for civil and human rights, what do you think were some of the most effective ways that Father Hesburgh worked? Or what are some of the greatest lessons we can take, or trainings we can do to sort of be effective in this type of work?
My sense is that he was a tremendous bridge builder, right? So none of the stories I told tonight mean to disparage the role of private citizens in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I mean, clearly the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues and all of the members of the public who came out and protested was tremendously influential. But there is something special about the Civil Rights Commission, which was an official government body that was authorized by Congress and appointed by the president. And so it had the institutional stature. And then when that institutional stature was linked with Father Ted's personality and leadership, it did really thoughtful and thorough work that gave the Commission's recommendations unique credibility throughout the civil rights debate. And so you see in the congressional record from the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, multiple members of Congress saying that they were directly influenced by the Commission's work, which is to say they were influenced by Father Ted's work. And I think that that's by virtue of charisma and intelligence and the ability to build bridges within the Commission itself, right? I mean, he was building bridges with conservative Southerners who weren't necessarily inclined to agree with him, and they all learned together. So I think it's just kind of the gentle moral leadership that he provided that performed that important function.
There's time for one more.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm also a first-year PhD student in theology and peace studies. And I'm interested if you could interpret at all, maybe I should ask him personally, but as you understand Hesburgh's tapestry of activity in relation to education and civil rights, how you might interpret where we're at today in terms of like inner city schools. I lived in Camden for 10 years, and it would be hard for me to imagine a worse situation of urban education and how things are, to where, you know, it's hard for some people to imagine any solutions in sending their kids to public school. So it feels very hopeless, and wonder if you have any insights from your perspective of this view, what hope there is.
I mean, I think it's easy in 2013 to look back to the 1950s and realize what a stark choice the country had in terms of integrating its schools and resisting efforts to keep schools segregated. So in some ways, it was an easier situation that they confronted. They just had to make a moral choice. What's the right thing to do? Today, you have a much more difficult situation from a legal and policy perspective, where you have segregation that results not from necessarily intentional discrimination, but from unintentional discrimination, from housing patterns that are presumably freely chosen, although you can question that. And so it's a much more difficult situation today where you have entrenched segregation that's harder to combat through a single provision in a law or a single court decision. And so in some ways, I think Father Hesburgh was entirely correct in the statement that I read at the end of my talk, that the problems are the same, and yet they're still more difficult today. And so that's the real policy challenge going forward.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you again, everybody else. We have two more small items of business before we adjourn across the way to the ballroom at La Fortune. One is to please thank our speaker, Professor Jennifer Mason McAward. You want to come down and give this to Father Ted with me? Why don't you hold it? Thank you. The second item of business, Father Ted, we've retrieved from the archives of the Hesburgh Library one of the many photographs of the Civil Rights Commission. This one shows you, it's the one being projected for all our guests here. It shows you on a fact-finding mission of the Commission from 1962, I believe it is. And we've had it framed for you. We'd like to come down and present it to you.
Father Ted, thank you so much. Thank you.
The same photograph is available for all of you as you leave here at the exit on these little cards with a little timeline of Father Ted's contributions to the Civil Rights Commission, so that you can all take it and keep it on your student bulletin boards, where it will be a reminder of a great legacy, not only of Father Ted, but of this university, and a mandate for us to go out and do likewise. For now, though, we will go out and just across the way to a reception in the La Fortune Ballroom. We hope that all of you will be able to join us. Perhaps some of you can ask those questions more intimately of Father Ted that you had. And Father Ted, before we go, we would ask you, if you would please, give us a benediction as we go on our way.
The best benediction I know is not of God directly, but of the Mother of God. And so I love that saying, Nos cum prole pia benedicat Virgo Maria. May the Virgin Mary bless all of us with her wonderful child. Amen.